Good evening. Good evening. My name is Noel Snyder, and I'm a program manager at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And on behalf of the Worship Institute, I am really pleased to welcome you all here tonight for this lecture from Dr. Andrew Root. Do you say it Root? Root? I heard you say Root earlier. Did I hear that wrong?
That's where you are.
Okay. It's a sort of a crick sort of thing. Yeah. Well, I'll say it Root. Dr. Root is a professor of youth and family ministry at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the author of many books on youth ministry, but also ministry more broadly. And much of his recent writing has focused on what it means to do ministry in a context of secularity, ministry in a secular age. And in fact, his 6 books in that series, the Ministry in a Secular Age series, have just been turned into a 6-volume set with Baker Academic. So the Worship Institute invited Andy here to do a week-long seminar called Ministry in a Secular Age. And so he's here. We're very happy to have him here this whole week and also to offer this public lecture now as a part of his visit with us. So as we prepare to hear from Andy on the topic of the waiting church, how to face this crisis, let us pause for a moment of prayer. Almighty God, your word tells us that we are to wait for you, that in our waiting we are to be strong and to take heart. And yet we so often find it so difficult to set aside our own timelines, our own fears, our own priorities, our own strategies, and to do that, to wait. We lift up to you so many churches who are experiencing this sense of crisis. And in the midst of that crisis, we acknowledge that it is so difficult for us to slow down, for us to set aside our anxieties, because we want to do something. So we ask your forgiveness, Lord, that we sometimes foolishly run ahead of you and foolishly forfeit our peace because we want to do something that may be out of step with your Spirit. So help us, Lord, tonight, and give us wisdom and insight as we hear from Andy, and give us strength and courage to do what it says in your word, to love you with our whole selves, to love our neighbors as ourselves, as we wait on you. We pray all of this in Christ's name for his glory. Amen. Let us welcome Dr. Andrew Root.
Well, thank you all for being here. Some of you have been with us all day. Others are new. Thanks for coming. And you all are real party people that you're here on a Monday night. And so thanks for coming and being a nerd or whatever you are. So here's where we're going tonight is I want to think about the fact that we are in crisis mode. That it feels almost unequivocal that we're in a moment here across Protestantism, if you're a church leader, where it feels like the church is in crisis. And usually, however, it feels like when we try to define that crisis, it gets a little bit slippery. But we tend to think that the crisis is around our modes and our functions, that we just aren't really sure how to be church, what to do. And in any crisis, it always feels like you're not exactly sure how to act. And one of the things I think a lot of pastors have been told is in the midst of this crisis and not sure how to act, leverage your strengths. Figure out what your strengths are and leverage those strengths. And one of those strengths we're often told is your story. Figure out your story, what sets you up as different, and leverage that story. So there's a sense inside of crisis mode that you have to somehow make yourself the star of your story. If you're going to survive, you have to be the star of your story. And yet theologically, this is a big problem. That the church, I think we can say this confessionally, cannot be the star of its story. The church has a story, in a deep story, but in a very odd kind of way, the church isn't even best supporting actor or the direction that the star is trying to attend to. The church gets to narrate a story, But really, the story that the church is trying to enact and live out of is the story about God, and the story about God's love for the world and God's ministry to the world. And yet often when we're in a crisis mode, we're told, get your story straight, find out what sets you apart, and leverage the strength of your story. And yet from an ecclesiological perspective, the church can't be the star of its own story. And I don't really know any other collective where that could function. I mean, maybe in some ways as a parent, you try not to be the star of your family's story, but like a company couldn't function that way. I mean, I hate to admit this, but I watch a lot of Shark Tank. And when you watch Shark Tank, and I do find myself sometimes at the end of a very emotional Shark Tank cheering, yay, capitalism, because it does feel like, capitalism saves all the days. But the thing you'll hear over and over again in Shark Tank, you'll hear two things. One, they'll say, well, that's a product, but not a company. I'm not even sure what that means, but they say that all over again. It's a good product, but I'm not sure it's a company. Hence, it's not really investable. But the other thing they always say is, tell us the story about this. Tell us the story, which is a kind of counter. It's kind of counter to what they have just said, because they actually want to know what's the human dynamic in here. What am I really investing in? And maybe it's just because it's a TV show and they need to have a story and there needs to be tears, but it's always very moving as people tell the story of how they came up with this idea that became a business. And it really does point to that a product alone cannot hold the narrative necessities that we need. So even when we have these like bio movies that are supposed to be like a biopic on the iPad or something, or the BlackBerry. There's a movie about the BlackBerry. We have at least 3 Canadians in the room, and there's a movie about the BlackBerry. So when they're about like Apple or some other tech company, they're never really about the product. Like they're about the product, but they end up being about the personality. So all these biopics about Apple are not really ever about the iPad or the Mac. They end up being about Steve Jobs and his personality. Or if you did see the BlackBerry movie, which is the most Canadian movie I have ever seen, and I think you Canadians can verify this, it's a movie about the personalities, the people who shoot BlackBerry to the top of all mobile phones in the whole world. And they tell this story, but then in classic Canadian way, they also tell the story about how they go down to nothing. And the movie ends with saying, in whatever it was, like 2006, BlackBerry had 85% of all the market of cell phones. Today, they have 0. And it's like, that's Canada, and we love it. We'll just revel in the fact that we can go up, but we also haven't won a Stanley Cup in 3 decades. So, we'll also deal with that. See, now people are getting angry with me. But it is fascinating that there always has to be a story behind this. So if your company is going to be successful, it has to have the story. And there is no real such thing as a product having a story. I mean, the closest thing you can get to a product story is its user guide. And if you are into reading user guides, well, you're weird. I mean, you are a very, very strange person. If you said, well, one of my favorite things to do is sit around and read product user guides, it becomes a very strange thing. Now, I say all this because I think it has ramifications when we think about our ecclesiology. Because when we think of the church, even functionally, even in the midst of this crisis, we're thinking we are a kind of small business and we got to get our story right because we got to set ourselves up to have some differentiation within the market. What ends up happening is you flip things around and you become self-centered on your own story and God becomes your product. And then the best you can do is give people a kind of user guide to how to extract from God the goods that are supposed to be there. And you can see this can become a major problem when God becomes the user guide. So I think our big issue here is we have the crisis wrong, that it's a wrong crisis. Now notice, I am not saying there is not a crisis. There actually is a crisis. I'm not Pollyanna-ish about a crisis, but also the fact is that if you're Protestant, we live with there always being a crisis. Like to be Protestant means there is a crisis at hand. But I think the crisis is not that we don't have enough. The crisis is, well, God is God and you are not. The crisis at the core of, I think, what it means to be Protestant is that God is wholly other, that we have to respond to God, that God is God. That's the crisis. The crisis isn't that we don't have enough resources, that we don't have enough relevance. The crisis is that God is God. Now, one of my favorite Martin Luther stories, the story goes that he is in Wittenberg and he's lecturing on Genesis 1 and 2, and a student raises his hand and says, "Professor Luther, what was God doing before God created? What was God doing before God created?" And the story goes that Luther sighs and says to the student, "God was cutting switches to beat people who ask such questions." Now, I fantasize about being able to say that in my classroom. I'd be quickly in the dean's office if I said that. But Bonhoeffer repeats that story in his little book, Creation and Fall. And he says, in classic Bonhoeffer way, he says, Luther wasn't only cutting down the student. You think, geez, Dietrich, yeah, you are very emotionally astute. That was a major burn. I mean, he is cutting this student down. He says, but he wasn't just cutting him down. He was also making a theological point. And his theological point he was making is you don't have the equipment to think about God behind the way God reveals God's self. The only God you can know is the God who makes God's self known. So it is an utter waste of time to try to get to some place, into some metaphysical netherland where you can think about God beyond what we would say in theology, the revelation of God. God making God self-known. So the crisis is God and you are not. The crisis is this God reveals God's self, but how do you discern that? How do you know when it's God who speaks and not the fact that you had a glass of wine and a NyQuil at the same time and are hearing a lot of different voices and things? The crisis is that this God is the God of the universe who speaks and moves history, and yet you have to discern what this God is calling you into, and particularly for a lot of people in this room, lead a community into. Now, the problem is if we get the crisis wrong, if we forget that the crisis is that God is God, then we slip into a very ancient problem, is that we become and we move into a form of idolatry. And we start to when we even make the church an idol. When we think that the church needs to be saved, or we think that we have to find the church's story and leverage its strength for some kind of market share, we even can make the church into an idol. And part of the issue with idols, with all idols, is idols always lift up busyness as a good. That busyness becomes a particular thing that they demand more and more action, to do more and more. And at least the communities that I'm in, I would imagine you share this in the room, that it feels like, especially for middle-class, upwardly mobile people, busyness has become almost a kind of form of nobility, that you ask people how they're doing, and they say, I'm good, but I'm busy. And it's supposed to really signal two things at once. When you ask me how I'm doing, and I say that I'm busy, I'm telling you that I'm living well. You know, I'm in demand. I got things to be. I had to fly from Minneapolis to Grand Rapids last night. I have to give an evening public lecture. I'm busy, man. I got a lot going on. I'm living well. But I also tell you it with a deep sigh because I am aware that it's exhausting me too. So my busyness also has this potential downside that it could be exhausting me. It could even, if I'm not careful, burn me out. So you ask me how I'm doing, and I tell you, I'm good, I'm busy. How's my family doing? We're good, but we're busy. It is an interesting thing that across at least the American context, it appears that busy churches attract busy people. Have you ever noticed that? It's a weird thing because it could work the complete opposite direction. I mean, you could imagine in places of hyper-frenetic action, like in Manhattan or in Los Angeles or really anywhere, in any kind of suburban, urban area, there would be all these opportunities to join a religious community where you just sit in silence. I mean, there is an alternate universe where you would think that the Quakers are having their big moment right now because everyone is so exhausted that they just want to come into a worship space, and it just be silent and sit there. That could make sense, but it doesn't work that way. In most places across Protestantism, overly busy people are looking for an overly busy church. They want a church with all the program offerings, with more things to do. There's an odd way that busyness attracts busyness, which maybe shows that this has more to do with a moral imagination of what it means to live well, that we think busyness actually says that we're living a good life. Now, to give us a little theory on this, there's a mid-20th century German Jewish philosopher named Erich Fromm, who wrote this really nice little book called To Have or To Be. And there's a piece in it that's like 3 pages in a section called Activity and Passivity. And if those of you who are in the academy class, we're going to talk a bit one of these days about Hartmut Rosa's work, this German sociologist who's talked about the acceleration of modern life. And what's kind of fascinating if you're an academic nerd is those 3 pages, you can see the whole trajectory of Rosa's work in those 3 pages. That essentially he's tried to mine those 3 pages and give us a whole theory around those. But these 3 pages are really fascinating. And one of the things that Fromm says, he has this quote, he says, in the modern sense, activity means a quality of behavior that brings about a visible effect by expenditure of energy. What he means is he thinks that in the modern period, that good action, or what action that has value becomes, is the expenditure of energy. That action is the expenditure of energy. Now, what's very, very fascinating, at least from my perspective, is he thinks that we get to this equating of action with the expenditure of energy because of the Protestant Reformation. And essentially what the Protestant Reformation does is it equalizes all action. It says, well, there aren't the praying class, the nightly killing class, the knights, the killing class, and the working class. And everyone has different forms of action, and everyone has different speeds in which they're doing that, different ways they're relating into time. Essentially, the Protestant Reformation says all action is now equal. So you get that echo of Martin Luther, who says it doesn't matter if you are a priest giving the Mass, or you're changing a baby's diapers, or you're milking a cow. All of these are now holy vocations. So all those actions are equalized. And the point of the Reformers is to make all of those actions sacred. So now sacredness is not just what you do in the monastery, it's what you do in your daily vocation. But a little thing happens, of course, and those of us in the academy, of course, we're going to continue to tease this out tomorrow, is that as time unfolds, that equalizing of all action, that raising the bar of all action, well, some people decide to just lower it. And the whole modern project decides that with the equalizing of action, what if we have no sacredness to it? Actually, what if we hollow sacredness out of action so we can continue to speed it up, so we can continue to grow it, so we continue to do more with it? Then the only evaluation of good action becomes who expends the most energy. So when we start to rank which action is the best action, whoever expends the most energy, or a little word we would say, whoever's working the hardest, their action has the most value. So the sociologist, one of the founding fathers of sociology, Max Weber, one of the things that drove him, that he found the most interesting, that he wanted to discover, is how it became, across the Western world, that hard work became a good. You know how middle-class parents talk now? Like, well, I know we're going to 55 Little League baseball games a week for our kid, or our child has played in 8,000 basketball games this year, and we really want to get a scholarship. But the throwaway is, if she doesn't get a scholarship, at least she's going to learn to work hard. And so, like, the value of working hard, I think we all want. We all feel like, if I'd say, well, you know, he's a good guy, he's a hard worker. We think, well, that's great. That's someone we want on our team to work hard. Weber's point is that wasn't always the case. It wasn't always a high value to work hard. Medieval dukes weren't thinking, I need to be a hard worker. You know, that's important to me. And even the praying class wasn't really thinking about working hard. So how did this happen, that hard work was a good? Now, I grew up in Minnesota, and some of you will know this. This will also irritate Canadians. But one of the things that is one of the greatest moments in American history, for sure, for those of us from cold places that play ice hockey, is the 1980 Olympic gold medal, the miracle on ice. If you want a Canadian to roll their eyes, say, hey, you want to talk about the miracle on ice? They will roll their eyes so hard they will hurt themselves at it. But when I was coming of age, I was starting to play hockey right after the 1980 Olympics. So I don't remember it. I wasn't old enough to remember it, but my life right after it was all framed by the miracle on ice. Now, the bigger deal for where I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. If you can connect the dots, the great coach of the 1980 Olympic team, Herb Brooks, is from St. Paul, Minnesota. So we all grew up going to hockey rinks, and these Herbieisms, like if you've seen the movie Miracle, there's the Herbieisms, the things that he would say. Those of us who were raised in Minnesota at this time were just indoctrinated with Herbieisms. And so we would skate around and basically chanting these Herbieisms. One of them was this. Herbie had this thing, Herb Brooks, that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. So how are you going to get these 19, 20-year-old kids to beat the great Red Army team? They're going to outwork them. So we would skate around as 6-year-olds basically chanting, hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And my daughter now can repeat that because as her parent, I raised her saying, hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. But this is all really a legacy of the hollowing out of action. That action has no other value, no other marker than to work hard, to expend more energy. So if we had to rank who is doing the best action in this room, well, we would probably be a bad sample to do that because we'd have theological things to say. But if we were all just people selling widgets and travel salespeople, we would think the person who's doing the best action is the one who's working the hardest. The one who is, beating the ground to get more sales. They are doing the best. Or if you need this to be more existential, and I guess now I'll just do therapy in front of you, every fight with my wife is about the expenditure of energy. Who has expended more energy? So here it is, the great domestic conflict. It is 9:30 at night, and that dishwasher is not unloaded. And it is neither of our jobs. It is the oldest job, but he is out. So we look at each other and like, who's going to unload this dishwasher? You know how we decide who does this? We don't decide on gender roles, or we don't decide on the fate of what the gods say. We start rehearsing who's expended more energy today. Well, why do I have to unload the dishwasher? I had to pick up 2 kids, and I picked up all the dog poop today. I had 4 meetings, and they were terrible. Well, I had to get all the groceries, and I had all to do this. And we start evaluating who's expended the most energy, because whoever expended the most energy wins the privilege of not having to unload the dishwasher. Or I hate to tell you this, but this is the conflict on every theological faculty. Where people like, someone needs to serve on this committee. You need to serve on this community. You think, why do I need to serve on this community? That idiot over there doesn't do anything. He's written 1 book review in 10 years, and he doesn't have to serve on the committee? In other words, I've expended more energy. I'm at Calvin University having to do lectures, and now I have to serve on some curricular review committee? Come on, look at how much energy I'm expending. And Fromm's point is we don't really have any other measure of what's good action than the expenditure of energy. And you start to see why busyness starts to hold moral value. Because if I can convince you that I'm busy, then I can convince you that my action, I guess, is somehow good or has weight. So the best action becomes the action that exerts the most energy. I do find it interesting, and I won't throw all consultants under the bus, but a lot of consultants for your church will teach you or will unpack strategies to help you extract more energy from your congregation, or help you to organize your own expenditure of energy so it might be more efficient and optimized. But you can see how this creates a whole cycle of exhausting us. And it happens because there is this sense that there's been this transition, and this is a phrase Taylor uses, that we've had this transition from what you do to how you do it. So after the Protestant Reformation, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. Do you do it with attention? Ultimately, do you do it with the expenditure of energy? And this sames all of our action. All action is the same. So whoever is expending the most energy, that becomes the only way to evaluate this. We sometimes think there's other things, like maybe you've spent a lot of time cleaning out your sock drawer, but someone else is teaching 8-year-olds how to write poetry. We tend to think, well, maybe that's more valuable. But when a push comes to shove on whose action is more important, we start to wonder, well, whose job is harder? Which person is extracting the most energy? That's the person who deserves respect. Now, what do we do with this? Like, how do we respond to this reality? Well, we need a different kind of form of action. And it does move us into thinking that maybe what we need to learn to do is to take on a form of waiting. How do we actually wait? And you can see why waiting becomes the enemy in the sense of the expenditure of energy. But there is a deep sense that waiting is a theological reality. And especially if our crisis is the crisis that God is God. And the crisis isn't lost resources, lost relevance, lost market share, but the crisis is God is God. The only way to respond to this is in many ways to wait on God, and to wait in a bit of a dialogical position. So let's take this a bit biblical, and where does the church start? Well, usually in conversations and with folks like us, we think where the church really starts is in Acts 2. And if you're an American, you particularly love Acts 2. And the piece of the text that just makes your mouth water is when we're told that thousands were added to their numbers. Now that sells. Like, that sounds great. But what we forget is that is actually not where the church starts. Now, I don't know if you've talked to biblical scholars before, but if you ask biblical scholars, like, what's your area of research? They'll say things like, well, I really study Paul's epistles, or they'll say, I study Matthew, and then you'll ask somebody else, and they say, I study Luke Acts. And then if you're like me, you're like, what? Luke Acts? They say it really fast. I say Luke Acts. And you're like, I don't know that book of the Bible. What's going on? Yeah, I study Luke Acts. And what they're saying very fast is, I study Luke and Acts. But Luke and Acts are one kind of thing to study, because Luke and Acts are a part 1 and a part 2. And you know how sequels work. Acts is the sequel of the Gospel of Luke. And you know how, we've all watched enough TV to know how part 2s, or enough movies to know how part 2s work. You can start your sequel by doing a pre-remembering thing, like 10 years before the last time we saw this was happening. Or you can project out into the future, and you can say 50 years later, now we're picking up part 2. Or what you can do is you can just start part 2 immediately after the first movie ended, like the second after. And that's how Luke does it. So Luke ends with the men on the road to Emmaus. And the men are on the road to Emmaus. They are living in deep grief. Everything they hoped for has been broken. And they happen to have this stranger walking with them. And of course, it's revealed that this is Jesus himself with them. And Jesus gives them a command. If you remember, Luke ends and Acts begins with the men from the road to Emmaus to return to Jerusalem and wait. The command that starts the church, the command that gathers the church, is to go to Jerusalem and wait. This is where the church begins. Yes, God moves, the Spirit moves, and thousands are added to their number. But it first starts with going and waiting. And waiting in consolation, in sorrow, in confusion, in hope, with a possibility of God moving and acting, and to wait. And I know to say that the response, and maybe what the church needs in the midst of the crisis, is to wait, is you hate this. Like, to tell a group of people you have to wait, to tell late modern people they have to wait, absolutely hate it. And part of the reason for that is modernity. The project of modernity is to take all the waiting, all the wanting out of waiting. It's to take all the wanting out of waiting. It's to tell you that any waiting is actually wasting. So if you wait, you're wasting. And to take all that wanting out of waiting. So as soon as you want something, you should be able to get it. The faster, the better. So all of us now are Homer Simpson as we take all of our waiting out of wanting. One of my favorite Simpsons that I remember from watching in college is where Homer comes into the kitchen and says to Marge, "When is dinner going to be ready?" And she looks at the microwave and says, "In 7 seconds." And Homer says, "Oh, why do I have to wait so long?" And that in many ways encompasses the modern condition, is to take all waiting out of wanting. And so your Amazon droid will be here any minute dropping it off for you. Or the only kind of waiting that we allow for, actually, is a kind of Black Friday kind of waiting, where you have to wait in anticipation, wait to burst, to get cheap products fast, to run over all other human beings, to be able to get a $65, 65-inch television. This is the kind of only waiting we allow, is not a waiting in a sense of restfulness, but a waiting to have frenetic action again. So it's a bit like Shawshank Redemption, where Andy says to Red, either get busy living or you get busy dying. But the point inside of modernity is you get busy and you stay busy. Because if you don't get busy and stay busy, then you have to confront the fact that you're dying, that you are a finite creature, that you have finitude all over you. But again, if the crisis is that God is God, then this changes things. Then it isn't about frenetically expending energy to get more, but there is a sense of waiting as faithfulness. And what we're waiting on is God to act. So we go to the very beautiful Psalm 46, that says, "Be still and know that I am God." I had an Old Testament scholar friend tell me that one way you can render that text in Hebrew, like the picture still in the Hebrew, is put down your hands and know I am God. Put down your hands and know I am God. Stop doing all of this stuff. Stop fighting me. Just put down your hands and know that I am God. So waiting is a form of action. That waiting is a kind of form of action. There's a great pietist German from the 19th century named Blumhardt, who wrote a book called Hastened Waiting, that there's a sense of a anticipation to this, an anticipatory waiting. So there is a sense that waiting is a form of action. Waiting is an attentiveness. We wait attentively with a vision. Waiting is a school, that we wait with a deep sense of a story, trying to see the world in some way. That waiting is resistance. When you think at the core of the civil rights movement was to wait, to go to a diner counter or go to the front of the bus and sit and to wait. So there is a way that waiting is resistance. Waiting is joining persons in suffering and in laughter. Waiting is living, and living as the psalmist in the world. And we forget this, but for Luther, the very image of the faithful theologian, the faithful pastor, is to live as the psalmist, to live in celebration, in sorrow, in praise, and in pain is the faithful way to live. So there's a deep sense that I think it's living in this anticipation of waiting. Now, we should say that there is some bad waiting. I was really pushing this idea, and then I got a new Apple Watch, which is about the most bourgeois thing you can say. I got a new Apple Watch. But I did, and I happened to be there on a Sunday, and I made a terrible mistake because the guy who was giving me my Apple Watch said, "Do you want me to set it up for you?" I thought, I could use this off my to-do list. So sure, I could. That would be great. And he said, okay, and he went to set it up, and it had to do a software update. On a Sunday in the Apple store, all the bandwidth being eaten up, I had to sit there and watch that little bar go from 1% to 2%, and then I got like 30%. It was like, I've gone too far. I can't cancel it and go home. I have to wait this thing out. And I just watched each percentage after each percentage. I have to tell you, there's no redemption in that kind of waiting. It's just awful, hellish kind of waiting. But there is a different kind of waiting that we're getting at here, which is waiting in anticipation. waiting with a story, waiting with a vision that becomes significant. So when you wait, you need to be waiting for something. Better probably, you need to be waiting for someone. And even as you wait for something, the kingdom of God, you wait for someone, the very revelation of Jesus Christ, you need to be waiting with someone in a community that you need to be waiting. You need to be waiting with someone. You need to be waiting for something with someone, I think, significantly. So this means that this kind of waiting, I think the kind of propaganda of modernity is to say, to call your communities to wait, well, really that's just a waste. And a bad leader would focus just on waiting. But actually, the leadership level here is high. How do you get a community to wait for God to speak? How do you get them to wait in anticipation? This is a big demand on a leader of how you do this. It isn't to kind of just expend more and more and more and more energy, though we've seen, as pastors have done that and built incredibly big churches, we've also seen just as many have to crash those churches or their own lives against a brick wall to get out of the cycle of expending more and more and more energy. So this is costly. There is a costly sense of what it means to wait. There is a high leadership of how do you help a community wait. And you need to give them something to wait for. You need to build a community that can be someone for each other as they wait. But probably what you need is to have a watchword more than a mission statement. I do find it really interesting that every Protestant church I know has a mission statement. And it's probably good that every organization probably needs a mission statement. But for the most part, a mission statement is exactly that thing. When you write your mission statement, back to the beginning of this lecture, you do think, what is our story that sets us up and makes us different amongst all the other churches there? What are our unique resources that we can leverage for our own survival? I mean, mission statements are fine. Every institution probably needs a mission statement. But what is interesting is that every church has a mission statement, and almost no church I know, or very few churches I know, have watchwords. And watchword is different. Even the phrase watchword, most Americans don't use that phrase. You'll sometimes hear Europeans will use that kind of watchword kind of phrase. But essentially what a watchword is a shorthand story you use to wait, to look into the world, to watch for something. An example of a watchword that is historical, that's, I think, quite powerful, is Martin Luther King Jr. had a watchword at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. And the watchword came from an experience of pain and loss. He realized that the Montgomery bus boycott was not going well. It wasn't going well. And then he was awoken in the middle of the night, and on the other line was somebody who was threatening to bomb his house. He had his first child asleep in the room, and he couldn't get back to sleep. Fear for his family, fear for his child, but also needing to come to grips with the fact that this wasn't going how he thought it would. That out of his own expenditure of energy, he was not able to make this happen. So this is called his coffee table experience. He's at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and he prays. And he says, God, this is not going well. And he hears God say back to him, Martin, when there is no way, I will find a way. And for Dr. King and that early civil rights movement, this became their watchword. This God makes a way out of no way. So he preaches one of his most beautiful sermons in Chicago that's called the No Way God. But he sent these people to be in the world and essentially wait as they anticipated that this God will move out of no way. My friend Mike Woods, who just retired as a pastor, he told me, we always had a watchword. He said, I would have never called it a watchword, but we always did. And he told me this story. He said, well, we got a watchword in our congregation because he said, I was the associate pastor at this church that he ended up being at for 30 plus years. He said, I was in charge of the education, and I'd come out of seminary, and I was ready to run this Sunday school to be, the most amazing thing in all the state of Wisconsin. Like I knew everything about everything, and now all I needed to do was get these Sunday school teachers to follow my directions, and we would be going here. So he's doing it, and it seems to be working well, except these 7th grade Sunday school teachers. These 7th grade Sunday school teachers just are not following his lesson plans. And then weirdly, he keeps finding them in weird places. With a small group of 7th graders, he'll find them underneath the table in the room. And then he finds them once in like the boiler room. And he's just, what is going on here? And he's getting a bit frustrated. Well, this young adult comes back to their church. And these people, these 7th grade teachers, they're called the Jurgensons, are their names. And they've been teaching over a decade, long before Mike had ever been at the church. And one of these young adults comes back who was in the Jurgensen Sunday school class back when he was in 7th grade. And he says, I'm here to see the Jurgensens. He says, oh, you stay in contact with your 7th grade Sunday school teacher? You stay in contact with the Jurgensens? He says, yeah, every year on my birthday, the Jurgensens call me and sing happy birthday to me. They have every year since 7th grade. And Mike thought to himself, well, I want the Jurgensens to sing happy birthday to me. So he started to realize maybe something's going on here. So he sits down with the Jurgensens and he says, so what are you guys doing? How are you teaching this Sunday school class? And now he isn't like interrogating them, saying, get on board. He's saying, something beautiful is happening here. How are you doing this? And they go, oh, I don't know, we're actually terrible Sunday school teachers. So we're terrible Sunday school teachers. They say, I used to think that. But no, now I really think, no, I think you're pretty good. He said, they said, no, we're terrible Sunday school teachers. I said, what do you mean? He says, no, we're really terrible. He says, we only have one thing we keep teaching the kids. And I said, well, what's that? He says, we should have other lessons. You give us these great lessons to teach them, but we only have one thing we can tell them. We keep telling them, nothing can separate you from the love of God. We just keep saying this over and over, and every time we teach anything, we just always want them to go away, knowing nothing can separate you from the love of God. See, we're terrible. That's the only thing we ever have to say. And Mike thought, no, there's something really powerful here. So the pastoral staff started to preach this. They started to use this language all the time, that nothing can separate us from the love of God, that we're on watch, that we hold as a watchword this sense that nothing can separate us from the love of God. And he asked them, he says, well, why is this so important to you? Why do you want to teach kids this? And they told him this incredible story. They said they had this son who had special needs growing up, that he couldn't hear, that they had going through middle school, going through high school, he was bullied really severely, and every night they would pray for him and remind him, nothing can separate you from the love of God. Nothing can separate you from the love of God. They got him into young adulthood, got him through college, he got married, and then tragedy struck. He got sick, and he died. And everyone in the congregation knew this story. And these 7th graders knew this story. And when they said nothing can separate you from the love of God, it embodied this deep place of faith, of yearning for God. It was a psalm that was in part of this whole community. And when Mike heard this, he said, yeah. So they started to talk about it all the time. They'd talk about nothing can separate you from the love of God. Nothing can separate you from the love of God. And most people there knew what this meant, that it went all the way back to the Jurgensens. He said, it must have been the grace of God, because what happened is after we had started to use this as our watchword for a couple years, we had a young mother in our congregation. We still to this day don't know what happened to her. We think maybe she had Lyme disease or something, but she got ill and she ended up taking her own life. And he said, at her funeral, I preached, nothing can separate you from the love of God. And Mike said, what you do to find your watchword in your community is you listen to a lot of their stories. That your job is to repeat back to them the stories that you're hearing. Wow, it seems like God is moving this way. And he says you pay particular attention when people tell you a story and you think to yourself, that sounds like a Bible verse. That you remember that. And then your job as the leaders to knit those stories together and give the community, as a way of respecting their stories, this watchword back. But then together you wait for God with this watchword, expectant that God is going to move. There's freedom, but there's also anticipation in the midst of this. One of my favorite Dietrich Bonhoeffer stories is that after the illegal seminary at Finkenwalde was closed, one of the main proprietors of Finkenwalde, one of the main people supporting it, was a woman, a grandmother named Ruth Kleister Ritzvau. and she was helping support the Confessing Church. She was a big fan of reading Karl Barth and loved Dietrich. And so she begged Dietrich, as the seminary was closed, Dietrich went and moved in at her estate and was living with her and still doing his Confessing Church work. And she convinced him. Eberhard Beke, his biographer, says she strong-armed him to catechize and take her grandchildren through confirmation, that she wanted Dietrich to take her children through confirmation. And Beke says he's pretty sure she did this because she wanted to sit through the lessons. Like she wanted to hear Dietrich teach confirmation. Well, he takes them through confirmation and he preaches their confirmation sermon. And it's the second confirmation sermon. There's two of them that we have from Bonhoeffer. And this is the second one, and he preaches it on Mark 9. The Father, I believe, help my unbelief. And it's a profound, profound sermon because it's utterly filled with the sense of sobriety. Dietrich tells these young people, he says, hey, this what we're doing here, very important. Any confirmation service, any act of worship that we might do is incredibly important. But let's remember, we never confess our faith in Jesus Christ in a church service. We always do it out in the world. And he is thinking, the days are coming where these young people may have a gun to their head. Will they confess Jesus Christ in this environment? And he tells them, he says, we never can be too proud. We have to remember that there is no appropriate adjective to ever put in front of faith. There's no kind of hyperbolic adjective we can ever put. It says if we had to put an adjective in front of faith, the only adjective we could put in front of faith is weak. Like the Father in Mark 9, our faith is always a pleading next to doubt. It's always a yearning for God to act in the midst of our sorrow and suffering. And then he says something really quite amazing that's worth us thinking about in the context of leadership in our congregations. He says faith itself can never be banked. You can never create a program where you can bank faith. Faith is like manna from heaven. It will always rot if you try to save it. The only faith you can have is enough faith to get through today. And if you can help these young people, Bonhoeffer would say to you, have enough faith to get through today, then you can help them and you've given them the practices the next day to get up and try to have enough faith for the day. And that starts with this kind of holy ambivalence of waiting, this holy sense of waiting for God to act, waiting for enough faith to make it through the day, trusting that God will give these good gifts to have enough for the day. But you do need a story. You do need a watchword. You do need a community in which to do that kind of waiting. But I guess the big question here is, yeah, that's all good, but we are in unprecedented times. I mean, this is the worst times that the church has ever faced. These times are utterly brutal and awful and terrible times. So it might be good to wait. Those may have some biblical antecedents. There may be some good narratives in there. But, my gosh, don't you know, across our denominations, our churches are closing all the time. Don't you know that most churches in America are, and this is quite true, one roof leak away from never being able to recover. These are unprecedented times, or so we think. So a few years ago, my family, it was my wife, Cara, who's the mystic in our family, woke up one day and said, I want to do a pilgrimage. And I thought, well, let's do it together. So we decided we're going to do a family pilgrimage. We were going to go walk some path. We decided that we were going to walk St. Cuthbert's Way in the borderlands of Scotland, and you walk it all the way to the northern part of England. And so we decided to plan this and to do this. We had two younger age, one late middle schooler, one early high schooler, and we planned it. We planned it for July 2020. Well, in March 2020, and I saw a tweet, someone saying, I'm canceling all my summer plans. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, this is going to be over in like 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, what do you mean you're canceling your summer plans? Just couldn't believe it. But of course, it gets canceled. So then we replan it for 2021. And in June 21, Europe opens. It's available. Well, unfortunately, Scotland never opens, not without a 14-day quarantine. So we replan it for 22. And finally, August 2022, we go on this. It ended up to be in God's great wisdom because now we had a rising senior and an incoming high school student going to be a sophomore. And it became a pilgrimage of us letting our kids go, of what it meant to actually let go of our children as they walked with us. And Kara tells this beautiful story of seeing Owen out ahead and having this desire to say, wait for us, stop, and feeling this spiritual move of just letting him go. And then in one walk in the haze of this Scottish morning, she would see this figure out ahead, and she'd realize it was a stranger. No, it was her son. It was a stranger. No, it was her son, as she was doing the most loving act for him of letting him go. Well, this walk ends 63 miles. You get finally to the holy island of Lindisfarne. But to get there, you have to time it. And there's really two ways to get to Lindisfarne. You can go on holiday and you can go visit Lindisfarne. There's a causeway that will take you across, and many people do it. They go up there. Tourists, they cross the causeway. There's great ice cream on the island, and there's a castle to see, but you have to time it because you can only get there when the tide is out, and you have to get back before the tide washes in. But the way you do it if you're a pilgrim is you walk the mudflats across. So we walked it the last 4 miles. We walked it together. Of course, Owen way out ahead. He kept his $120 hiking boots on through the water, and we had to let him go from murdering him for destroying his $120 hiking boots, but it was letting him go. But we get to the end of this thing and we've done it. Now we only have like 400 yards to go to get to the old abbey, and we have done it. 63 miles of a holy walk with Jesus. And I had my Martin Luther experience. I don't know if you know this about Luther, but in 1515 he walked a pilgrimage from Saxony to Rome. He got to Rome, and he hated everyone in Rome and everything about the holy city. And this was one of the antecedents that Reformation needed to be happen. Well, I had that experience because we go from the beach, and all the tourists are coming down out of their cars onto the walkway, and we're now sharing a walkway, and they're going to get ice cream, and I'm finishing a 63-mile walk for Jesus, and I'm like, get out of my way. I hate you all. I am here for Jesus, and you all are just going to get ice cream. Not a great experience. And we were culpable too, because of course as soon as we got there, we just grabbed our phones and did a selfie. But then we went and found our accommodations, and there's only like 30 rooms on the whole island. And this strange thing happens is we disappear to our rooms, we shower, we're going to spend the night there. We come back out around 3:30, and the whole island is transformed. It's a different place. A veil of kind of holiness or sacredness has fallen over it. All the tourists are gone because the tide is in. Now there's only about 100 people maybe on the island. Half of those people are in the fishing industry. The others are fellow pilgrims. We walk over to the abbey, and it now is speaking. But then we see this church. We walk over to the church. We take and do evening prayer in the church. There's about 30 of us. Half of those pilgrims, others, people in the fishing industry. We pray together. We then walk around this old church, and we recognize that some of the stones in this church have been on top of each other since 635, when Aidan, the cultic Saint Aidan, came to the holy island of Lindisfarne. But we finally walk to the back of the church, and we see this picture on the back. This is a picture you can't quite see. Maybe you can see it a little bit. But it lists every bishop, prior, or vicar who had ever overseen that little church since Aidan in 635 all the way down to Sarah Hillis in 2018, who took over as vicar of that church. Everyone since 635. And you think, the church has been here a long time. I had been taught since I was a youth group kid that it was my job to save the church. I was told since I was a youth group kid that the church really wasn't, you couldn't trust it. It was an old parent who couldn't really cope anymore. It was time to take the keys away from the church because it might just hurt people. And yet when you look at this sign, you see that it can parent you. It can hold you. But here's the amazing thing. You can't quite see it, but I think it's the second group under priors, first column. There is a period from about 700 to about 1000 where there is no bishop, there is no prior, there is no vicar. Because what happened is these very strange thin boats started coming down from the North Sea. And of course, you know this was the Viking raids. And all the monks on that island grabbed their holy accoutrements, grabbed Cuthbert's bones, and wandered in Northumbria for 300 years. Longer than America has been a country. And then we're back. Finally had the Durham Cathedral built for them. But you think about that. These are not great times, people. All of you in leadership of the church, you are not doing ministry in a golden era. No one is going to look back on the first 3 decades of the 21st century in Protestantism and say, these were the golden times. But there have been worse. Things are tough. But there are no Viking raiders. There are no Viking raiders breaking into your church. I mean, I say that tongue firmly in cheek, but we do think we can't wait. We can't wait on a God who is God. These are unprecedentedly terrible times, and that's catastrophizing. The church has lived through much more difficult times than this, and it has gotten through because the church, in the end of the day, is simply the body of Jesus Christ, and the body of Jesus Christ will continue. Now, there is no guarantee that our denominations continue. There's no guarantee that even beautiful institutions like this seminary continue. But the very body of Jesus Christ, a community of people that tell the story, confess in pain and suffering, the living God, it will continue. So your job is not to save anything, because this church can parent you, and Jesus Christ's body saves. And it is enough. So leading people and waiting on a God who will move in this way may just be the very thing that could renew us and give us life. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for these people. And God, may we learn what it means to wait on you. We wait on you, God, because you are a faithful minister. Because, God, you are the one who walks into death and brings life out of it. So we wait, God, because you are good and you are faithful and your promises are true. Amen. So we are right at 8 o'clock. Do we have about 10 minutes, I guess. So let's breathe. This is my recommendation. We're going to have a mic that will pass around. We only, like I said, have about 10 minutes. If you need to go, please go. I'll just assume you're deeply offended. That's totally fine. And but why don't you just take a breath? Maybe if you'd like, just turn to someone next to you and just debrief. What still lingers for you? What maybe insight did you have? And we'll just take 1 minute and do that, and then we'll turn and we can have about 7-8 minutes of conversation. Sound fair? Yep. All right, I'm going to interrupt you. So any questions, comments that you want to make, anything that we can tie together before we call it a night? Noel has a mic.
You spoke briefly about waiting as resistance, and
Yeah.
that really captivates me. So can you just maybe elaborate on that some more?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, there's probably two things to say, is that one of the things that waiting has done in those traditions, say of the nonviolent resistance, is it actually is a proclamation of one's humanity. And that says, I wait here with my humanity. And there is a sense that at the core of our humanity, I mean, you can hear echoes of a kind of Sabbath sense. You can hear echoes of Brueggemann's sense of Sabbath as resistance. That there's a way that the whole point of the Sabbath command is to give us our humanity back. And so I do think both Gandhi and even more directly the civil rights movement is mining that tradition. That waiting is the assertion that even the structures of society must honor the value of human beings. And human beings are made for encounter in life, and really at its core made for dialogue and connection, not made for the expending of energy. And yet our systems often do that. And we even feel like some people must be made into instruments for expenditure of energy so other people can rest. And this becomes a very ancient historical injustice, is that all people aren't invited in to rest and to wait with one another because it has to be a ranked system. So I think that it plays off of those traditions. Yeah. I would really like it if we could go side to side so we could just see Noel run across the room. Yeah.
In addition to kind of being countercultural, the busyness aspect, or the trying not to make it all busy, I'm also thinking about this from a brain perspective, in that our brains crave controllability and predictability. And so they don't like to be in a state where there's unknown. Yeah. And so some of our cultural milieu of being busy is really making our brains happy to be in a controllable and predictable world. Yeah. And how, as people of faith, do we kind of reshape our brains away from that pattern?
Yeah. That's a really good statement. I don't think that the opposite, I personally could not cope with this. If the opposite of waiting or what we would want instead of busyness is like chaos. I don't want us to see this as chaos as a good. I mean, there's a line throughout, I think, the biblical assertion that God acts when God creates out of chaos and gives order. And order is a good thing. But there is a strange element about, particularly Hartmut Rosa does this so beautifully, is that the modern project is one of control, but it is not a kind of sinister wanting to control everything. That the move to control, first of all, starts from the impetus of good, that we would like not chaos. You know, like when, at one level we think of natural disasters and storms. I mean, the chaos there is just terrifying and bad, so we should create structures and institutional structures as well as just building restrictions and things like that to make sure that chaos doesn't come. But all of a sudden you can get to a point where you have people who never even go outside. You know, or he says it even the positive end. For instance, I make it up into the mountains and the mountains speak to me. And I think this is amazing. Like, I'm moved by these mountains, but the modern kind of move is to say, I love these mountains. I love that they speak to me. I would like to be up here more. The problem is it takes me a whole day and a half to climb up to these mountains. But you know what? If we could get a road up here, I could get up in these mountains in 20 minutes, and that would be great. And you know what? You get hungry, though, when you're up here all day having these experiences. I should build a little shop right here, and then we can do that. But you know what? I can't really fund that shop unless I invite more people up the road. And then we should sell tickets to it, because then we could kind of control this. And the next thing that occurs, the kind of tragic element of the late modern life, is the very thing that used to speak to us, we've strangled. So there's this balance between no to chaos. Chaos is not good for brains. It's not good for human societies. I mean, one group of people who loves chaos, historically, dictators love chaos because they can cope with chaos and they can control through chaos. So chaos is not good. But then over control isn't good either. So how do we get to this place where we have order, where human life can thrive? This is what Bonhoeffer means by the orders of preservation. That there has to be structures in society that uphold and preserve life. But if those become so intensely structured that they strangle out the possibility of the uncontrollable, then we also lose something as well. So there is a balance. I do not think the good thing to do in your church, I mean, this is why waiting is more than a good metaphor. It's a good practice, but waiting is interesting to slip into, because waiting is a place of trying to rest in a moment. And that usually isn't chaos. And I do think part of the leadership demand for, say, a pastor, ministry leader, is to not allow chaos to go. I mean, isn't this Paul's point? Is that if you're going to speak in tongues, there should be someone there to interpret it. In other words, like, chaos cannot be in itself a good. But we also can't go to the other side, which is to strangle any opportunity for the Spirit to speak, for the uncontrollable God to meet us in an uncontrollable moment. But there is then a level of, like Athanasius says, God became human so we could become God, which is a bit of a misinterpreted perspective. But Bonhoeffer reverses that in ethics and said God became human so we might become human. And I think one of the elements of what it means to lead communities is, what does it mean for us to be a community where we uphold each other's humanity? And the human spirit does not do well under chaos, but also not under strict control. And how do we balance that? Yeah. Yes. And yeah, we'll
Okay,
do
I'll
two
be
more
quick.
maybe, and I'll try to be briefer.
This may be beside the point, but what say you to the church or the community that isn't necessarily feeling a crisis of decline at all,
Yeah.
but is growing, is kind of rapidly expanding, is like celebrating anniversaries and look how many more people have come, and oh no, we have to go to 2 services because we don't have any more room because all these people are coming. Kind of how do we apply the same or a different thought to speak to that?
Yeah.
Problem.
So similar to a point I would make, that happiness is not worth living for. But what I would say is, like, if you get happiness in your life, take it. Like, be happy about it. Like, take it as a gift that it is. So therefore, there's no opposition to growth. The text in Acts 2 isn't, and then thousands were added to their numbers, and that's when everything got really screwed up. I mean, that is a gift. That was the working of the Spirit. So it may very well be the Spirit who is bringing that growth, and we might celebrate that. But the impetus is nevertheless the same, is what does it mean to be faithful to what God is doing here? And how do you even narrate that? And this is the real challenge, I think. How do you narrate this as always and fundamentally the gift of God, and not the amazing thing that you did? Therefore, you got to leverage this into X, Y, and Z. And then in the trap, which goes back to the chaos thing, is what growth can potentially do is growth is fine. In the Christian tradition, growth is there. Though the growth that's mainly spoken of is growing into someone, not growth of something. But even growth of something can be a holy endeavor. But there is a big problem when growth gets hooked to the logic of escalation. And therefore, growth must not be received as a gift, but it must always then be outperformed and outperformed and outperformed. And part of Rose's argument is this is just how modern institutions work. They stabilize themselves dynamically. So any nation state's economy has to grow itself, or it is in risk of all coming undone. Civil war might happen if it doesn't grow. That's why every politician across the world, but particularly across the West, says, vote for us. We can grow the economy. So if you are and this has happened with multiple examples we can look at, people who took a gift and their church grew quickly, but then realized the only thing that would even stabilize their own identities as pastors is further growth and further growth. And then you know what you discover? Having a board that asks you to discern how you're spending money or what you're doing slows you down. And so then what you say is, there should be no board. I should just make all decisions. And then a few people say, no, there really probably should be a board. And then you say, the devil is in you. And you are standing in the way. And then you say publicly, at this church, you either get on the bus or you get run over by the bus, because growth must continue. The problem wasn't that growth happened. The problem was then the leader thought it was their responsibility to keep it dynamically going, and that more growth and more growth and more growth. So again, I mean, I think how do we, and this is an incredibly tricky reality because we live so deep in this system, but how do we unlink growth from a logic of escalation? That always is saying you're playing the roulette wheel, and if you don't keep expending more energy, you're going to go from 10,000 to 0. I mean, what's actually quite interesting is the church that I'm cryptically referencing goes from like 10,000 to 0. Like the BlackBerry. Absolutely. And I actually think that is the best word to end this, that church and person who shall not be named was the BlackBerry of churches, and please start working on the movie script now. So, thank you all. Well,